When was the last time you heard Old English? Was it in a movie about knights and kings, a Renaissance fair, or maybe Shakespeare? Well, what if we told you none of that is Old English? In fact, we're betting you've never heard it. Because while those things are all English, and they're all old, they aren't Old English. Today, we're going to be talking about language change and how, over time, something unintelligible became what we know today. In particular, we're going to talk about three specific kinds of change: sound change, sociolinguistic change, and lexical change. To explore this, we'll be looking at English, and that means we're going back in time. English came from a language called Proto-Indo-European, or PIE, spoken over 6,000 years ago. Now, we're not going back that far. In fact, even if we wanted to, we couldn't. Linguists don't know what PIE even sounded like. What we do know is that people who spoke PIE eventually spread through Europe, and as they split into different tribes and cultures, their language split as well. Flash forward, and in the decades following 400 AD, Germanic tribes were settling in Britain. Jutes, Saxons, Angles. Their languages were changing. In particular, the sound was changing. P's were becoming F's, B's changed to P's, G's to K's to H's, D's to T's, and so on. If you're wondering why these changes happened, well, congratulations, now you're thinking like a linguist. But strange as it is, nothing caused these changes. They just happened. And they aren't random either. English is a Germanic language. Other Germanic languages went through similar changes, including German, a sort of distant cousin to English. After all these changes, all the migrating and dividing of different speakers, a new language developed, which we call Old English, or they would have called it English. Do you think you could understand it if you heard it? Let's see.
What we gardena in yer dachum theod kuninga thrum je frunon huta atelingas elen fremidon.
It's not easy, right? Still, you can find scraps of it in the English we speak today. Sounds kept shifting, words changed meaning, but the so-called function words like that and the and of and, those all stayed pretty much the same. The rest isn't so straightforward. To understand it, we'll need to talk about sociolinguistic change. Old English was spoken in Britain for a long time, over 600 years, and it kept changing in small ways over time, but it wasn't until 1066 that things really kicked off. That was the year of the Norman invasion, and it's where the story of English gets a little complicated. We'll leave the details for your history class, but in this period, the English-speaking world was ruled by French-speaking Normans. This kind of cultural shift can have a huge impact on language. The rulership and nobility all spoke Old French, while the commoners held on to their Old English. But that separation is almost impossible to keep. How could you rule if no one understood you? What if you wanted to sound refined and high class? French trickled down into English, and much more rarely, English went up into French. The result is what we call Middle English. This blending happened all across the language, but again, it wasn't random. In fact, the words we borrowed from France are still seen as fancier. House is a Germanic word, but the French word for house became mansion in English. Peasants eat, and the nobility dines. In fact, the peasants who actually dealt with cows and pigs ate cow and pig, but at the nobles' dinner table, they were beef and pork. Still, French might not help you if you're trying to understand Middle English. Here's what it sounded like.
One that April with his sure sote, the drucht of marsh hath perse to the rote, and bathed every vine in switch liqueur, of which vertu engendred is the fleur.
Maybe you recognized some words, but probably not many. Because there was one big change left for English before we can understand it. It's called the Great Vowel Shift. The Great Vowel Shift started around 1350 and continued into the 1700s. Every vowel in English changed, from a, e, I, o, u to a, e, I, o, and u. In this way, fold, hoose, and die became food, house, and day. With that, we have early modern English, the first English ancestor we can actually understand. Early modern English is where we find Shakespeare, and the shift from Shakespeare to modern English is big, but not so much compared to Beowulf. But if early modern English is supposed to sound like our English, why is Shakespeare still so hard to understand? Well, setting aside that Shakespeare was a poet, the difference actually comes down to vocabulary, what linguists call lexicon. The needs of one generation of English speakers are wildly different from the needs of the next. Just like we don't need the words bodkin, pard, or scutcheon, Shakespeare didn't need taxi or a smartphone. Words change to suit the people using them. We add, shorten, and invent the things we need, and we forget the things we don't. Think of it this way. A chef might talk about shiitakes, portobellos, morels, chanterelles, but for most of us, mushroom is just fine. If there's one golden rule of linguistics, it's this: language changes. Sometimes out of necessity, sometimes for cultural reasons, and sometimes language changes for no reason at all. Those changes don't make a language worse or better. All it means is we speak differently from our ancestors and from our descendants. So if you're struggling through that next page of Shakespeare, just sit back, take a deep breath, and imagine the bard reading Twitter.